person again.
Good, yeah.
Would not recommend going to the UK for only 2 days.
Oh no.
Looks like some audio is
not
coming
time
through
to
now.
adjust there. Not time to adjust back.
We have audio
Yeah.
now, so they can all hear what we're saying.
Oh.
So I just went through this whole speech, hey folks out there on YouTube, about what our meetup is going to be about today. And none of you heard it because we didn't have any audio, but now it should be working. Mitch, you can confirm that for me. So welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. Today we're talking about the mainstream discourse in basic income, and it's something that people are talking a lot more about these days, and we tend to kind of get into the nitty-gritty, into the weeds, and now we're kind of taking a step out and back into the real world, connecting up with what people are maybe talking about out there a little bit more. So we have a couple articles that some of us read. One of them is called Why Universal Basic Income is a Bad Idea by MIT economist Daron Acemoglu. And then the other one is an interview with Annie Lowrey, the author of Give People Money, a book about basic income that she published last year. So I'm going to read a description of what we mean when we talk about basic income. I usually read this before we start the live stream, but since we're talking about the general discourse around basic income, I want to make sure that everybody has a sense of what we mean when we talk about basic income. So we're here to talk about basic income. The term basic income can mean different things to different people. The broad definition of basic income that we use for this discussion is a regular income unconditionally paid to all members of a community. It doesn't have to be an amount that meets people's basic needs, though many members of this group believe that such an amount is achievable. It doesn't have to be paid out by a government, though many members of this group imagine that it is likely to work this way. It doesn't necessarily correspond to a taxation system, though many members of this group believe that taxation is necessary to fund a basic income. The implementation of a basic income doesn't necessarily imply anything about changes to other forms of government spending, and the interval of the payout is unspecified, though many members of this group believe that a shorter interval is better. So with that introduction, I want to again start to go around the room and ask people what they think the general public might be getting wrong about basic income, and what insights might be useful to help them talk about it in a more fruitful way. Go ahead.
Well, I guess the main argument against basic income that seems really plausible in the mainstream discourse would be that it would be more...
And ask people... Yep.
Would be that, most people are imagining some sort of limited set of funds being allocated in different ways, say across a country's economy, and a basic income seems to be maybe less efficient than spending that money, whatever money you'd be spending on a basic income, in a more targeted way to give money to the people who need it the most, or to indirectly give them money by funding certain programs or things like this. So according to the economics that we talk about a lot in here, there are a couple of differences. So one is that according to the economics we talk about in here, kind of not a dollar is not sort of using up as much productive capacity from the economy in the hands of a wealthier person as in the hands of a less wealthy person. So that might be less costly to give money to wealthy people in terms of what you're able to supply to less wealthy people. I guess another difference is, just the general idea that it's not necessarily coming from a sort of limited pool of resources.
So you're saying it's not the case that we have a fixed amount of money and it's just a matter of deciding where to spend it to get the most bang for our buck, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. And the limited resource that one would be working with, which would be the productive capacity of the economy, like you could still raise the same concern, like why not funnel money to the poorest people so they can take advantage of that capacity, because they're the ones that really need to. So that's why I was bringing in that difference in terms of like how many resources is a dollar really using up in the hands of different people. Right. And so, is it worth the cost of kind of making it seem like a special needs sort of like welfare program and the logistical difficulty in like means testing it and the sort of complications with how it might affect the economy if it's only going to some people. So you kind of have to weigh those things against other things, but yeah.
Okay.
Anyway.
Steve.
Well, I think the Acemoglu article has a lot of problems, and other criticisms of UBI are written in more of a political or pep rally kind of way than a technical way, and I think that misleads people.
Well, basic income wouldn't cost $4 trillion. That's the gross cost. What's it called? The
Net cost.
Net cost would be less than $1.5 trillion, which is, considering we spend like about that much on other welfare programs, that makes it far more affordable.
Okay, Elizabeth.
I mean, echoing a lot of what Bethany said, and sort of relatedly, because people are often working with sort of fixed pie idea of like, oh, well, we only have so much money to spend, that there's this idea that giving out universal basic income would mean that we would have to slash like other programs, because that's often how it gets pitched, especially by people on the right, to be like, well, okay, we'll give people money, and so then we don't need to give them like food stamps or whatever. And I mean, we've talked about how sometimes if you give people enough money, then okay, they don't need food stamps because they can just buy food with money. But there's often other concern about like, oh, well, if there's funding for daycare or like other things that people might actually need, that you would need to actually like pay for the services. And so sort of piggybacking on the like, there's not actually a fixed amount of money that we're working with, like that. I think that's really helpful for being like, okay, we can still have these, like the government can still provide these other services. It's not a trade-off of you can either do UBI or you can provide like medicine for poor children.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the big things, and that'll come up as we go through the articles too. I liked Steve's comment about the Acemoglu article. I think there's a lot to look at in here, and a lot of it is very reflective of kind of the mainstream view. But part of the reason why I picked this article is that I think it's really well written, and it doesn't come at it from this kind of political pep rally kind of perspective. He's really kind of explaining his his reasoning and that kind of stuff. So it's something that's easy for us to kind of like grab onto and get something useful out of. So I'm excited to get right into a quote from the first article, unless someone has any comments before we start.
Can you remind me who Acemoglu is? Did you already say that?
He's an economist at MIT.
Okay, he sounded familiar.
Yeah. I think you probably heard about him through like Motion and stuff.
Yeah, probably, and through you probably too.
Yeah. So first quote is just the very beginning introductory paragraph to the article, which is, one should always be wary of simple solutions to complex problems, and universal basic income is no exception. The fact that this answer to automation and globalization has been met with such enthusiasm indicates a breakdown not in the economic system, but in democratic politics and civic life.
I have something to say about that. I guess I'm not sure I would characterize the response to basic income as enthusiastic overall. Like, considering, I guess it depends on what your expectation is. But considering it's a policy whereby everybody would get more money than they currently have, you might start with the baseline expectation that everyone would be really excited about it. And like, that's definitely not the response. There's a very small minority of people that are in favor of it.
Yes.
So I guess I'm not sure I'm with him on he obviously has a different baseline expectation, which is that it's a totally insane idea, and like any enthusiasm, he has a different expectation, so it seems enthusiastic to him.
I also think, since when we first started talking about it, it has become a little bit more mainstream.
That's
and
true.
There are, it is a minority of people who are in favor of basic income, but depending on, how you define basic income to people, that can be a sizable minority of people who are for it.
Yeah, but let me just double down on the idea that it's free money for you, the consumer. And so, you would expect
everyone to be like jumping up and down. And
so people have clearly internalized the idea that like you have to like balance a budget, or like, there's some reason there that people are generally not excited about extra money going to them, no strings attached, which would, if it was like just a store giving out money to them or something, they would be really excited about. So I think
it feels not workable or not possible, or if you tried to do something, you would not get the desired effect or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my main criticism of this paragraph is that he talks about being wary of simple solutions to complex problems. Basic income is not a simple solution to a complex problem. It's a simple solution to a simple problem. The problem is that people need spending money.
Right.
And basic income hands them spending money. This is necessary for a functioning market economy. So I think, you can tell from the next sentence that he thinks about it as an answer to automation and globalization. And I think the fact that we haven't had something simple like a basic income in place has led to various complex problems. For example, our dependence on the labor market and our feeling that, people need to earn their income through jobs. And this is why things like automation and globalization even feel like a threat to anyone, because we're kind of, we have this expectation that people earn their incomes through the labor market. But it's not this, the automation and globalization are not the problem. They're, along with other social problems, including, like poverty and crime and, all that kind of stuff, they're merely calling attention to the fact that we haven't solved this simple problem in a simple way, that consumers need spending money, and that this is the most efficient way to get it to them. Yeah. Anyone have any more thoughts on this one? I got a lot of quotes. We're not going to run out of quotes.
Get to the, yeah.
All right, we'll get to the next one.
That's interesting.
Oh,
your mom's there.
Yeah, my mom mentioned. Well, first, Mitchell, in response to my initial opening question, Mitchell said there's an expectation from some that the only way to fund basic income is by taxes.
Yep.
And I think that's right. It's hard to see how a basic income makes sense if you are wondering where the government can get the money from. And you think about, if the government can get money, can they spend that money in, maybe more beneficial ways to society or that kind of thing. That is a big stumbling block. And if people stop thinking about taxation as being the thing that funds government spending, it might open up more flexible thinking about something like basic income. And then my mom says there are also basic moral objections, the free lunch problem.
Good point.
And I think this relates to the labor thing, right?
Right.
So we expect people to get their incomes from labor. This violates that expectation. It violates the idea that you have to kind of earn a living. And this is true even though we, the reason people are getting money from jobs, the reason people are getting the wages they're getting and the salaries they're getting is largely a result of monetary policy. So it's still money that the government decided to send to consumers because they thought consumers needed money, but they're doing it indirectly through the labor market. So it doesn't feel like it's the government that's giving you the money anymore. And then also it has a whole host of other problems. But it's important to remember that, the government makes decisions about creating jobs and all that kind of stuff. The wages being the level they are and the jobs being how they are is not necessarily how they'd be in an efficient labor market.
Right.
So it's still the government handing people money. It's just kind of hidden.
But I think it's hard to disentangle, as we've talked about, like how much of that government spending or government indirect encouraging of spending is going towards productive, useful things versus not. And so I think there can be an assumption that like it's all going towards productive, useful things. So it's not a free lunch, like, the government is stimulating the economy, but it's not like, doing so in a way that's not creating benefit. Yeah,
and it's also not a free lunch in the sense that you kind of have to work really hard in order to get the money. So it's like instead of just handing people the money, you hand people the money and say, oh, now you're forced to do this work also. Even if that work might not be necessary for
and
the
I guess
economy.
I would never think of it as a reasonable thing to say, like, well, it's good even if it's not producing a good outcome because the people are working. But actually, like, a once and future worker kind of makes that claim. So I guess there are people who would even make that claim.
So she's referring to this book by Orrin Cass, who's a guy I went to high school with, but he was also the domestic policy director on the Mitt Romney campaign in 2012. And he wrote a book called The Once and Future Worker, which basically makes the opposite argument of everything I say, where he talks about how important jobs are and how we need to create jobs for people and, use the labor market to kind of ensure that everyone is contributing and feeling like they're, earning what they get and that kind of thing, that it's like a psychological and moral thing that's really important to make sure everybody's working. Richard.
Well, what you were saying earlier about how the government interferes and creates jobs in the shadows. Well, in Wisconsin, they were putting up this Foxconn plant in by the Chicago Illinois border around Milwaukee, and the way they're setting up a tax deal is that they don't have to pay any taxes to build this factory on the land for this factory for like 25 years, and so they're not going to actually recruit any tax base for this property for 25 years, and is even the factory even going to still be there in 25 years? So it's sort of like with like stadiums and things for sports teams. They're not going to actually get anything for it. They're just like shopping around for.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting thing, right? You have cities that are trying to attract businesses and giving those businesses tax breaks so that, you know, those businesses will kind of create jobs and that kind of thing.
Right.
But if you think about the economy from a consumer's perspective, creating jobs isn't the goal, right? It's, you know, producing things for people. And no matter where the company is located, if you're talking about Amazon or something, you know, as a recent example, you know, it doesn't matter where Amazon's headquarters is; they're still going to be producing things for everyone.
In fact, you might not really want them around your city because of like the traffic and some of the other downsides.
By like Virginia and whatever, they're supposed to have it. They're worried about how the rents were going to skyrocket because of all these welfare employees and things like that.
So yeah, I mean, and you know, basic income can help correct some of these perverse incentives. If you care about your people being able to buy stuff on Amazon, you don't care as much about whether your people are working on Amazon if they're, you know, getting a basic income and they don't have to have jobs for that. And then there's also, you know, like we've I think mentioned here before that, you know, basic income can help with the housing market. If people don't need to live near certain areas, then they have more flexibility. Basic income is an income that's not tied to a specific location. There was a comment that you made, Bethany, a little while ago that I thought was really good and that I wanted to circle back to, but
probably it was one of those things that you've said many times.
One of those things that I've said many times. I don't know what it was.
Do you remember what it was related to?
I think it was related to the quote. But I don't know. Let's move on to the next quote.
Okay.
Yeah. So, owing to the inadequacy of the social safety net in the United States and other developed countries, proposals for a universal basic income are gaining in popularity. And this is an interesting framing. Does anyone want to say anything about this before I kind of go on my little rant?
Wait, other developed countries? Usually, I thought U.S. was usually like pretty low on the list, so I wonder who he's thinking of.
Low on the list for what?
Like having a social safety net, and if
for the inadequacy, you mean?
Yeah.
Or high on the inadequacy?
I guess it depends on what you think is adequate. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are, you know, I think every country is kind of struggling with this problem. You know, they feel like, you know, every country has poor people and they want to be doing better, and you know, that kind of thing. My issue here is that he's lumping basic income in with the social safety net. So I don't think it makes sense to think of basic income as a safety net program, because the safety net is designed. You know, like you think about the economy functioning in a certain way, and then for whatever reason, people aren't able to successfully participate and prosper within the economic machine. So then there's a safety net below that kind of catches them when they fall out of it.
Yeah, I guess, but thinking about, as we are in this group, like the social discourse around UBI, do you think that he might be partly right in saying that like part of the popularity has to come from the fact that other people also associate it with a way to kind of another way to make sure everybody is okay that kind of is similar to a social safety net or compensates for one or replaces it?
I think this accurately reflects kind of the mainstream discourse. Most people, when they talk about basic income, they talk about it being part of the social safety net.
I think that's what Elizabeth was saying too. Like a lot of people even maybe propose it as in tandem with getting rid of the original social safety net, something like that. Right, that kind of thing. I like to think about it as more fundamental economic infrastructure. You know, like I was saying, consumers need spending money. How do you get it to them? In order for the market economy to function, there needs to be a flow of money going to consumers. And you can have a basic income, or you can make up jobs for them to do, or you can make it, you can lower interest rates and make it really easy for them to borrow, you know, that kind of thing. What matters is that consumers have the spending money to be able to receive the benefit from the economy. Now, in terms of the inadequacy of the safety net, I mean, I think you could say that because the economy doesn't have is like missing a basic income. It's missing this fundamental piece of economic infrastructure that
it creates a need for this safety net, or more of a need for a safety net than we would have otherwise. And the changes in the labor market now have and changes in the global trade and all of that stuff now have more dramatic effects on consumers in terms of because it affects the labor market and all of that. So yeah, I think it makes sense that when these systems come under stress that it would draw attention to a potential for basic income. But I don't think the mainstream sees it as these things are the result of not having a basic income. I think they think of it as, basic income could be kind of included in getting these things to maybe work properly or something like that. The safety net. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Wait, say that last part again.
I think people... it's not the case that they think about it the way I do, where you need a basic income in your economy, or it leads to all these problems and complexities, and then as technology advances, as trade changes and everything, people get left behind and stuff, because you have to kind of distort the labor market to force it to support consumers, and that's never going to be a perfect thing, right? It's kind of I think of all of these other things, or many of them anyway, as kind of band-aids that fix this problem of a missing basic income in the economy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that is a very different perspective.
So that's my perspective, and that's not the mainstream
Right.
perspective. The mainstream perspective is that maybe there's something fundamentally changing, so we need a new solution because there's something something new is happening that we need to respond to, or something like that. Whereas I would say that, automation and globalization are merely calling attention to the fact that we've been incorrectly trying to get incomes to consumers through the labor market for a really long time. Like, this is not a new problem in the way I talk about it. And you have these issues come up every so often. Like we have the 2008 financial crisis, the Great Depression, or labor movements. Karl Marx, even Adam Smith, kind of made this mistake. The first line of Wealth of Nations is something to the effect of, the wealth of a country is produced by the labor of the people, or something like that, right? So it's baked into kind of economics from the very beginning. Yeah. Sorry, that was a little ranty. Yeah. Was there something you wanted to get at more?
I was just going to talk again about kind of where the mainstream perspective is probably coming from. Because, if you assume that most jobs are, there because something useful is happening, and you assume that the government can't really spend much more money than it can spend, then of course you're not going to see it, in the same way that you see it. So if you feel like there needs to be a basic income, it's probably because you feel like something needs to change, something is changing in the economy, or
right.
Or like you just want to replace the existing safety net, or you just, whatever. But.
Yeah. And I think, big things kind of do change in the economy every so often. And then we respond to those changes in different ways. Like we have minimum wage, unions, that kind of stuff. And, Social Security, and these various, safety net programs and stuff like that. And we have, anytime one of these kind of tipping points comes along, we have an opportunity to institute a basic income. In the past, we've failed to do so, and it's entirely possible that we'll fail to do so this time too. I think part of the mainstream basic income discourse is that a lot of people, especially basic income proponents, they believe that, oh no, the robots are going to take all the jobs, so basic income is inevitable. It's, we're going to need it. It's going to become obvious that we need it, or something like that. But we could just do what we've always done and kind of patch the system again. Like we can, I'm sure, we've talked before about a federal jobs guarantee, that kind of stuff. Like this is a way of albeit more explicitly, kind of continuing the status quo of making up jobs to force money to consumers.
And you used to feel that it was inevitable with automation too.
Yeah. I used to, until 2015 or so, I believed that, okay, basic, there's nothing I need to do. Basic income is just going to happen on its own because, all of these jobs are going to go away. I had that perspective for a while because it's kind of the intuitive thing, and it makes sense that people feel that way. Yeah. Okay.
Any other thoughts on this one?
like how we missed the opportunity in 1971 with Nixon. It passed the House of Representatives twice, but in the Senate, the Democrats thought that it was inadequate, so they didn't.
Yeah. And they were still framing it as like a kind of social assistance program, not as like the way the economy is supposed to work, but as helping support people who weren't able to make it in the normal way and that kind of thing. And I wonder if we keep thinking about basic income in this way, if it's going to be harder for us to kind of make it happen. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good point that like you get frustrated about a lot. But
Yeah.
I mean, I think that if you frame it in the traditional way, the arguments for it are a lot weaker, and that's part of the problem.
Right.
So one of the arguments is that automation will make it absolutely necessary, but if that's not going to happen, then that's going to look pretty weak. And another
Right.
argument is like, how do you pay for it kind of argument. And if you think about that in the traditional way, then I think, people like Daron Acemoglu have reasonable counterpoints, which is like, let's just focus this money on people who need it the most.
Right.
That seems more economically efficient. So, like the debate we watched a long time ago, where it kind of felt like that side, the anti-basic income,
The intelligence squared debate. Yeah.
One for that reason. So,
Yeah.
So it makes a big difference, and I can see why it would be frustrating. Or it's like, I guess another way to put it is, it's like it's kind of interesting that basic income has as much support as it does, considering those flaws too.
Yeah, it's somewhat remarkable.
And I guess that's his point here.
And my mom says, would framing it as a necessary part of the economy make it easier to accept? I think if everyone believed that it was a necessary part of the economy, it would be easier to accept.
Yeah.
Me just framing it that way, that's going to be a hard thing for people to kind of get on board with.
I guess my sense of it is that for the mainstream public right now, this idea of automation is probably going to be more galvanizing and more popular. It won't stay that way if like all these automation things happen, but we keep on making up jobs for people. But for now, that's probably easier to understand and like easier to access. But for an economist, if they were for some reason like willing to take the argument seriously, they don't have some of the like more obvious flaws. Like thinking of it as a basic part of the economy doesn't have some of the obvious flaws that Acemoglu was pointing out about viewing it in a different way.
Yeah.
Where you have a set amount of money and you're trying to allocate it this way versus that way. Then that gets into the nitty gritty of all the ways in which your view contradicts other mainstream economic views, and like, could you persuade economists, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I guess if like the economists got on board, people would potentially get on board, although I think it's like a difficult leap.
Well, it certainly helps. It's kind of this bootstrap operation. Like, the more people who get on board, the more people pay attention, that kind of thing. And if it goes, down the automation route, like, all the jobs are going to go away. Like you said, that can galvanize a lot of people, but then that can be a flash in the pan, because as soon as that doesn't happen, we're back to kind of where we were before, and we lose all those people who really kind of fiercely believe that.
I think another thing about the economic view is like it runs counter to the way that we run our personal finances, right? It's a very different like view of money in some ways. And so that's hard to like get people on board with.
I mean, we think of money as this thing that you have to kind of get from somewhere.
Right.
And we also think, when we think about the economy as a whole, we think of money as kind of like circulating through the economy, and it just kind of keeps circulating, and there's a certain amount of it, and the economy can sustain a certain amount of it. Whereas, the reality is that money flows through the economy. And it doesn't circulate back to consumers unless there's a mechanism to get money into consumers' hands. And it doesn't much matter whether you circulate back existing money or whether you give them new money. What matters is that the amount of spending power they have and the level of consumer spending is in line with the productive capacity of the economy. And that's just really counterintuitive to a lot of people. A lot of people think, oh, you add money to the economy, that will cause inflation or something like that. So my mom says, how could it be proved that it's a necessary part of the economy? And I think the simplest way to kind of demonstrate it to people is to just kind of lay out the fact, okay, consumers need spending money. How do you get it to them? You have options. You can have a basic income, or you can make up jobs for people to give them money. But to the extent that you are creating jobs for people for their own benefit, for the benefit of the workers. You're not doing it because there's work that needs doing. So then you have to ask, okay, is the labor market naturally going to provide all consumers with the optimal level of incomes that they'll be able to buy everything that the economy is capable of producing? And the answer is no. And we can see that. I mean, like, I can tell you like abstractly why that's kind of impossible, but we can also look empirically at, we have minimum wage. We have,
Tariffs.
we have tariffs, to create jobs. Politicians are like, create jobs, we need to create more jobs, create jobs, create jobs. They're not talking about that because they think, oh no, we're not producing enough stuff for our consumers. They're thinking, oh no, we need workers to have incomes, right? We wouldn't have any of this stuff if the labor market just naturally provided consumers with enough income. So if it's not the labor market, then what is it? And the answer, what is it? I mean, basic income is kind of what's left. You could increase the amount of borrowing in the economy, but that's not stable, and stuff like that leads to kind of the 2008 collapse, that kind of thing. If you had a basic income that's actually calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy, at least, what I tend to argue is that you don't have asset bubbles like that. You're not going to have a collapse like 2008. Yeah, Richard.
Well, how it could be proved is like giving it to an entire village, like with Give Directly in Kenya, that there's two villages right next to each other, and one of them that you see all these improvements and things in that village, and then the other one, depending on its distance, they might not have any improvements or anything like that unless they're going and providing the labor to improve the other village that's receiving the basic income.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's useful to some extent. I think the one of the things I like to say about basic income is that you can't test it without actually doing it. So Give Directly has kind of found a way to actually do it, at least at a small scale. Now, in terms of how that translates, it's hard to draw any conclusions about how that translates to kind of an economy the size of the United States or something like that. But we certainly can know things. I mean, the most of what we learn from these kinds of basic income trials is that people are better off when they have money. But we kind of already knew that. We know that consumers need money in order to buy things. That's not controversial. So I'm not a huge fan of most of these trials. The Give Directly stuff, I think, is a little bit a cut above because they're actually trying to test a small economy and the effects of it there. But it's not like that village has its own currency and its own central bank, and there are macroeconomic effects that you would see with a basic income that you can't capture at the level of the village. You might be able to see if prices kind of inflate a little bit within the village, but they can still take that money to other villages, and that money can dissipate throughout their country's economy. It's still a national currency, that kind of thing. Yeah. So my mom says it's hard to know how giving basic income will affect the economy as a whole. And I think that's right. And this relates to kind of what Bethany was saying before, where it's hard to know which jobs are wasteful and which jobs are useful, or, it's probably not on a per job basis. It's probably, what percentage of this type of work is necessary, that kind of thing. It's really hard to know. But we can know that people need spending money. That's necessary for the markets to work. So what you do is you calibrate, you gradually ramp up the basic income to kind of calibrate it to whatever the productive capacity of the economy is. Then you see where we are. We don't necessarily know what that's going to look like, but we do know that it's better because people will be able to buy more stuff. They'll be able to be more prosperous. So we don't know what jobs are going to be remaining, but Bethany mentioned, it's hard to know. Well, it's easy to know if you calibrate a basic income to the economy, because then whatever's left, those are the jobs we need, right? When you have an efficient labor market, the only purpose of wages is to incentivize people to spend their time doing something.
I guess especially if you changed other policies at the same time.
Yeah.
You could still have tariffs in place even with a basic income.
Yeah, and then we might see people look at things and say, oh, why do we have these tariffs again? What is this for? Why do we want to make it more expensive for our consumers to buy things? And then, we might look at certain safety net programs. They're designed to patch certain holes, and we've basically repaired we've repaired the thing that there were holes in. So we might look at these things and it was like, well, nobody's benefiting from these programs anymore, and we can eliminate them. But we don't know necessarily which programs those are and which ones we'll still need. Like I imagine, like we can make some educated guesses. For example, it's probably going to be the case that we still need universal healthcare. Like that's something basic that the government needs to provide, in addition to universal income and in addition to other forms of infrastructure, like physical infrastructure, roads and bridges and all of that. But would we need something like food stamps before? Like, is there going to be, if everybody has enough income to get the most out of the economy, is there going to be like an epidemic of people who are not buying food even though they have all this money?
But with something like food stamps, even if you kept the program in place, isn't it means tested? So like, wouldn't you really not have to change anything?
So maybe it might look and
like the
program's still there, but nobody qualifies for it anymore. That kind of thing.
Or if
There's
somebody
probably
for
gonna be a
some
lot of
reason
that,
did
too.
still qualify for it, then they would still get it. But like, if everybody's basic income is high enough,
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, there's a lot of times in the basic income discussion, it turns into a discussion about direct cash transfers versus in-kind benefits and something like that. So then you could ask the question, do they really need something where they're not allowed to spend the money on anything else? Like, is that really something that that a lot of people are going to have an issue with? That's an interesting question. I mean, I think even in a really strong economy that has a full basic income and everything like that, you're going to have people who are behaving in ways that are harmful to themselves and others, and we need to address that.
So you're saying the fact that you can only spend it on food could end up being useful because maybe like
I highly doubt it, but
theoretically, or like
I mean, that's why they do it, right? They think people are going to spend their money on things other than food, so they make them spend it on food.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
There's a quote in the Annie Lowrey article about how you can only spend in some states you can only spend the food stamps on sweet potatoes, not white potatoes.
Right.
Why? Because they're supposed to be healthier?
Food industry lobbying.
Really?
I think that's the reason. Yeah.
Interesting. I thought it was a health-oriented thing. Maybe they're trying
Well,
to.
I mean, I'm
There's
sure they
definitely a
make
lot of that,
they
too.
make
work
health
on
arguments.
diabetes or something like that.
You're not gonna lobby the government to do something without having some plausible science to back it up.
Well, I could imagine some smart politician being like, well, if we like reduce diabetes by this amount, then we're going to pay for the program, and so we're going to like tweak the food. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting that
some argument like
sweet potatoes are okay, but white potatoes
they
are
have
not.
a very different glycemic index. That's why I suspected that it was a
You'd
supposed
think,
attempt to try to influence someone
you'd think that
else's
the
health-oriented
sweet potatoes would be sweeter.
You would think
yeah.
that, but from what I've heard or researched, it's white potatoes spike your blood sugar a lot
That's
more, and so
interesting.
sweet potatoes are considered healthier. Now, whether that's really even true if you have them like with the regular meal with like butter and protein and whatever, this is just eating them on their own.
Well,
anyway, this is
we should
really
have another
relevant.
discussion sometime about basic income as it relates to potatoes. But
this is sort of the point. The point we're talking about with basic income is like, you have the choice to spend it on what you want as opposed to these kinds of restrictions. Yeah. What is it? And your mom said something too.
So she says, I think it's going to come about only as a response to an emergency, as the social programs in the Depression came about. Otherwise, too many ways to think it won't work.
Interesting.
So that's a possible path. My hope is that it doesn't come to that, and that hopefully discussions like these can help people think about it more as something that's necessary in general. And part of my worry about emergencies is that what we put in place might not be the right response, right? So we talk about the social programs in the Great Depression. Well, what was the best thing we possibly could have done during the Great Depression? It was a UBI, right? And maybe if we have another emergency, another labor emergency, jobs emergency, again, the best solution might be basic income, but instead we might do something like a federal jobs guarantee. So we can't, so emergencies might help push things in that direction, but we can't just rely on the emergency to make it happen either, because it could easily go another way, and we can kind of make the same mistakes that we've made before, similar mistakes. Yeah.
And when we make these errors, they become entrenched as part of our culture or something like that, and then it's harder to get rid of them.
Yeah, I mean the whole job thing is super entrenched in our culture. Earning a living, all of that.
Right.
So let's get to another quote. So this one I thought was cute. To be sure, if the only choice is between mass impoverishment and a UBI is preferable. So I mean, yeah, okay. But yeah, so I mean, I think, he's still, obviously for this whole article, he's thinking about it as like UBI is the solution to poverty, or not. He doesn't think it is, but he thinks, like that's the way to think about it, as like a possible solution to these social problems and stuff like that. But
the way I take that quote is he's being facetious, and he doesn't actually think it's a good idea or whatever.
He doesn't think he thinks, well, yeah, this is all we have, this is what we should do, but there are so many other things that are kind of more directly target the problems in a more efficient way, more efficient use of money, that kind of thing. That's how he actually feels. Yeah, so he's not thinking of UBI in the broad sense of what it means to the economy. I don't know if we really need to get into this quote. If you guys have any, all right, we'll do another one. But UBI is a flawed idea, not least because it would be prohibitively expensive unless accompanied by deep cuts to the rest of the safety net. So this is a very kind of mainstream view. Even a lot of basic income proponents will say that it should replace the safety net, that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that I entirely disagree with that. I think a lot of the safety net is in place to compensate for lack of basic income, but there's no reason why we need to remove the safety net at the same time that we introduce the basic income. We can introduce the basic income and
let people see that these programs are not needed anymore.
Right,
and
maybe
combine them into the basic income.
Or maybe nobody qualifies for them, that kind of thing. But I mean, I think he's thinking in terms of a budget constraint, in terms of there's a fixed amount of money. So in order to pay for the basic income, you have to kind of get the money from somewhere. And he kind of, I don't know, anyone have any more thoughts about this particular quote?
Well, the Hoppy said that he thinks that the UBI is replacing the safety net. But here he's pretending that UBI wouldn't affect the use of the safety net, the need of the safety net at all. But even according to him, the purpose of the UBI is so that people won't have to fall into the safety net as much. So the cost of the safety net should go down.
Yes.
Less use of the safety net.
Yeah, and I think he's saying that the UBI is such an inefficient use of the money that the amount of safety net programs you'd have to cut are greater than the benefit that you would get from the UBI,
right,
that kind of thing.
This is what you were pointing out, Richard. He estimates it at $4 trillion, which is like more than just the budget for social safety nets. It's like the whole budget.
Yeah, and really, I think it's understandable, and I think another thing that the mainstream kind of thinks about UBI. Most people, when you talk about basic income, they think it's an amount that meets people's basic needs, or it's a certain fixed amount that brings people up to a certain poverty level or poverty line or something like that, like $1,000 a month or something like that. Like they think about the amount as kind of like baked into the basic income proposal, and then the question is, how expensive is it? So this is what Acemoglu does, which is he says $1,000 per month would cost around $4 trillion a year, and that's assuming you give it to every citizen, even babies, and assuming that there's kind of like no tax bundled with it or something like that. But
he talks about tax below though.
But yeah, he does. And a question I like to ask. A lot of people ask. They say they assume the basic income is a certain amount, and then they say, how do you pay for it? Or can we afford this? Or is this a good idea? A question I like to ask to kind of help broaden the discussion is, what level of basic income is appropriate for the economy? And if your answer is 0, then you kind of have to justify that. Is the optimal level of basic income 0? And I have no answer I have no numerical answer for what the optimal level is, but I do advocate, algorithmically increasing the amount until we kind of reach what the economy can handle. Yeah.
I feel like we kind of talked about this one
Yeah.
a little bit because we talked about, a lot of people brought up the question of paying for it and how you pay for
Right.
it. Yeah.
So let's go to the next one. So in here, he kind of just dismisses it out of hand. He says, and no, a permanent UBI could not be financed with government debt or newly printed currency. So he doesn't explain why this is. He just, so he's focusing on other things in this article. He acknowledges that there are some people who argue these kinds of things, people like me, but he doesn't really get into it.
That's what people think of their. If that's true of their home economy, then it must be true for the government as a whole, and that's how people perceive these things. And that's how I'm just going to take advantage of that, so I don't have to explain it.
I don't know that that's quite his thinking. I think he has more sophisticated thinking behind this, but he does definitely feel like it's such a fringe thing that it's not worth getting into here.
Right.
And as far as this particular quote goes, he says, permanent UBI cannot be financed with government debt or newly printed currency. The first thing I want to call attention to is the fact that those two things are the same thing. Government debt and newly printed currency are the same thing. Anytime the government is going into debt or running a deficit, they are spending more money into the economy than they're taking out. It's newly printed currency. And I would go a step further and say that, in terms of broadening people's thinking about government spending, I think it's useful to think of all government spending as printing money. Whenever the government spends, they're adding money to a part of the economy that didn't have that money before. And either that part of the economy had room for that money or it didn't. So there is a constraint on government spending, but it's not whether you happen to take money from somewhere else in the economy. It's about whether there's room there in that part of the economy.
So in terms of thinking about public discourse, I feel like there are two different concerns that people have with these two different ideas. So government debt, there's the idea that we actually owe it to other countries, that we're paying interest on it the same way that you might pay interest on a mortgage. And people are really concerned that they're going to be in trouble later on, that our kids are going to,
our kids are going to have to pay it back,
our kids are going to have to pay it, somebody's going to have to pay it back.
Yeah.
It's going to be a problem. And so, and newly printed currency, I think, raises the idea of, okay, you have the idea that theoretically the government could just print dollars and not owe them to another country, but then people are concerned that that's going to cause inflation.
Right.
So it's interesting, like, even if you took the government debt, even if you agreed that we had to pay the debt back, it's interesting that there's not an equivalent idea that, like, oh, if you're, like, taking this money from other countries and spending it into the economy, why wouldn't it create inflation in the same way that printing money does, right? So, like, there's a lot of these ideas, but I feel like they're not, like, super fleshed out.
Right.
In the public consciousness.
And maybe I should substantiate the idea that these two things actually are equivalent. Now, in terms of government debt, government borrowing, there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes, a lot of interesting mechanisms and stuff like that. But what it comes down to is that the government is issuing these IOU notes, these treasury bonds, saying, "Hey, economy, I owe you, millions and millions of dollars," and then people buy them up. As investments, that kind of thing. Now, if the amount of these things the number of treasury securities that are kind of out there, the volume of them that are out there on the open market, that's a monetary policy decision. And that number doesn't have to change even if the government issues more of them, because the Federal Reserve, the central bank, can buy up as many of them as it wants and just hold them. So they're not out there on the open market anymore. So the end result is that the government issued treasury securities into the open market, and then they spent money. They got the money from the market, and then they spent money into the economy. And now, to the extent that it wants to, the Fed can buy those treasury securities from the banks and the dealers and that kind of thing. And then the end result is now there could be the same number of treasury securities in the economy, but there's more money. Because the government spent the money, but then also those securities got bought back by this other part of the government, the Federal Reserve. So in the end result, it's just that there's more money.
Right. And I think a way that can help me think about how what we think of as debt really isn't how it is that the government essentially owes that money to itself, which is definitely not the way
Yes.
that we usually worry about like owing to foreign countries and having to like pay those countries back, which we obviously have
Right.
some of that too.
To
But
the extent that the Fed is holding Treasury securities, the government owes money to itself. So what you did was you borrowed from yourself and spent money. That's like the end result, which is the same thing as just spending money to the outside economy. It doesn't matter that you kind of borrowed it from yourself.
money is
internally.
kind of like wild.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going back through the money and banking class that you always
Yeah.
pitch, but like I had no idea of it at all. I mean, we have a sense that there's like a fixed amount, like a fixed amount of gold or something, or a fixed amount of dollars, and that's it. But like even banks create money with deposits that go beyond their reserves, which is another concept that I think people don't even really think about.
Yep.
So money is being created all the time in all these different ways.
Yep. Yep. Most of the money in the economy is not spent into the economy by the government. It's money that's kind of indirectly created through private borrowing and lending, and then the Federal Reserve kind of decides how much of that there should be in the economy. So it's still the government creating money, but they're doing it through this other channel.
Right.
Yeah.
And nobody has a problem with that or thinks it has to be balanced or anything like that. I mean, they have a problem if there's too much credit, but it's a different model.
Right.
Yeah.
You have, if you need consumer spending to be at a certain level, the Fed will stimulate consumer spending by allowing people to borrow more. But then that creates fragility in the private financial sector. And that's something that's not stable, not sustainable. And also the distribution of that money creation is not optimal for consumers as well. The people who have money are the ones who are able to borrow more money.
So I guess in terms of like public discourse, there are these deep assumptions, and I'm like thinking of there's like different ways to kind of like poke holes in them or bring up like problems in them. And one is this idea that some of the debt is the government owing money to itself. Like you hear that, and if you take it in, you have to realize like you didn't quite understand what government debt was.
Right.
And then another one has to do with people kind of know that inflation has to do with people having more money to spend on the same goods. Mm-hmm. But then there's lots of ways that people might have more money to spend, like borrowing from other countries, like more credit. And we don't necessarily like the creation of more jobs that would give people more money. Well, that creates more stuff, so maybe that's different. But we don't necessarily make them all equivalent. And so I think maybe just pointing out that people are already holding these different contradictions in their mind. Like they're less worried about credit than they are about printing money when it comes to inflation.
Right.
And so why would that be?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to point out to people, and to point out the fact that we're always printing money. It doesn't require the government to be deficit spending or actually just printing money in order to be printing money. I mean, we're always deficit spending too, but we're also printing money through the private economy. The private economy is printing money as stimulated by the Fed, right?
Yeah, but that point is like harder from a public discourse perspective because it takes a lot more to understand. Like I'm thinking of where I was before knowing you.
Right.
And like I also had these same kind of assumptions that contradict each other. I didn't really think that much about them.
Yeah.
I didn't really think that much about economics. And like it would take me a little bit to like understand what do you mean the government prints money through the private sector? Not that that's a bad argument, but it's not as clear as like you've got to be wrong about something because people paying money for eggs with credit cards or whatever is the same as people paying money with printed dollars. So why is there a special status
So do you
printing dollars?
want them to get it? Is there a reason why they shouldn't be getting it from the basic income, or why it's better for them to get it through borrowing, or better for them to get it through jobs, or better for them to get it through jobs that are funded by borrowing?
Right. Well, I guess what I'm suggesting is not really like a complete picture where people would then understand it. What I'm suggesting is a way to get people out of these assumptions that are so deep, like questioning them like a little bit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because the assumption is so deep, like, oh, you print money, you have inflation, or like you borrow, you have to pay it back. And if you just tell people like some of the debt is owed to the government itself, they have to be like, wait, like there's some sense in like, okay, maybe I'm willing to listen to a little bit more of what's going on at that point.
Yeah.
Because I realized that I did not understand this at all before.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
I think that's a
I
good
think
point.
it's like part of it's about the negative connotations about like the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazi Germany and things like that.
Great point. Yeah, these historical examples when we did see like a lot of inflation, stuff like that. Yeah, that's a good point.
People will bring that up. Venezuela is a popular one these days.
Yeah, definitely.
Zimbabwe,
yeah.
Good point.
Okay.
Your mom has some stuff on there too.
She says, how does Andrew Yang say it will be paid for? So he goes the more kind of conventional mainstream route. He wants to pay for it using a tax. He wants a VAT tax, which is basically a sales tax. And the way he justifies it, it's kind of a moral justification. He says that the companies that produce more of our stuff are going to be the ones that use the most technology, and therefore it's kind of a tax on technology. So you'd get a slice of every Google transaction and Amazon, whatever, and Uber and all that. So it's kind of like a moral justification for the tax. Like technology is benefiting in all these ways, is benefiting the economy in all these ways. That money maybe would have gone to labor before, so now there's an equivalence, and we can say it's morally right that we get some of the benefit that technology provides. But he's still thinking about it from the production side of things, as in what's important here is that we need a cut of kind of what's of the production, rather than the fact that the technology itself is already benefiting consumers. If you just gave consumers the money, they'd be able to buy the stuff that technology is producing.
There's two other things he says about it. One is that, and I think they're important too, like one is that a lot of European countries have it already. Yeah. So he's sort of speaking to this point that you didn't highlight, but the article is also pretty dismissive of like the idea of funding it with tax revenue, saying that it would have massive distortionary costs on the economy. Right. And so indirectly, Andrew Yang is saying, like, look, all these other countries, that seem to be functioning okay, have really high value-added taxes a lot of the time. Right. And his other argument has to do with it's hard to evade. So we have a lot of you could try to tax Amazon directly to try to get that money back, but it's really easy to evade that. Yeah. By moving operations overseas as they already do, whatever. So.
If it's an indirect tax like a sales tax, then it's just taxing the transactions. Right. And if you're selling to American consumers,
you kind of can't get around it.
You can't get around collecting that tax. Yeah.
So I think that's pretty smart, and I do think that similar to the debt and newly printed currency, this article seems to not that there wouldn't necessarily be distortionary costs, but he kind of
for the VAT.
No, whatever tax you do. But he sort of says that really strongly. Maybe he backs it up later because I didn't read the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think any tax is going to have a distortionary effect on the markets, and depending on where you want the markets to be, that it might distort it closer to how you think is optimal, or away from that, or something like that. Right. Most people think it's away from that, but the taxing is really not necessary for a basic income. And Andrew Yang, I mean, there's certain legal constraints too. So when you talk about passing Andrew Yang's freedom dividend through Congress or something like that, there's something called the Byrd Rule, where if it's revenue neutral and it doesn't affect the budget, then you only need a simple majority of Congress to pass it through, and then it's easier to pass, that kind of thing. So I don't think Andrew Yang thinks about funding and basic income or thinks about money the way I do. But even if he did, the smart political thing might still be to have this VAT. And the VAT is not really that much of a problem, because it's not going to raise consumer prices, because we all know the Fed keeps consumer prices stable. Mostly what it's going to do is it's essentially a tax on production, so it might reduce the productive capacity of the economy. But it's probably not going to reduce it to a level that can't sustain a $1,000 a month basic income. So ordinary consumers are, prices are going to be pretty much where they are, and ordinary consumers, like where they are today, they're going to stay the same. And ordinary consumers are going to have an extra $1,000 a month to spend. Some people are worried that the tax is somehow going to be passed on to consumers, and that's true. If you have a sales tax in a smaller market or on a particular good, it will raise the price of that good. It will raise prices in that particular market. But if you're targeting the overall economy, that's the same thing that the Fed is targeting. So you don't have the same price effects. Yeah.
Do you think that the VAT would solve the problem of big companies hiding their profits all around the world?
I guess the first question is, do I think it's a problem that big companies are hiding their profits all around the world? And the answer to that is no, I don't think it's a problem. Will it make it harder for them to do that? It's not going to make it. It's going to make it harder for us not to take a cut of their profits. But once they have the profits, they can hide them wherever they want, I suppose.
But you take a cut kind of on the way to
It
the
makes
profit.
it does make it harder for them to hide from taxes. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. If that changes their incentives and they're no longer profitable doing something that used to be profitable that was really beneficial to consumers, then that could be problematic. That kind of thing. Yeah, it's hard to say. Okay, let's go to the next one. Sacrificing all other social programs for the sake of UBI is a terrible idea. Such programs exist to address specific problems such as the vulnerability of the elderly, children, and disabled people. Imagine living in a society where children still go hungry and where those with severe health conditions are deprived of adequate care because all the tax revenue has gone to sending monthly checks to every citizen, millionaires and billionaires included. So I mean, this is more of the same. He's imagining UBI as, you've got this pool of money and UBI is siphoning it away from more beneficial uses.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah, I don't know that there's much to say here, except the millionaires and billionaires included part. I just kind of want to point that out for a second, which is that, as we mentioned before, giving money to Bill Gates isn't going to change the amount of money you can afford to give to a poorer person. Or an ordinary consumer. And as Richard pointed out, most of the basic income proposals, not how I talk about it, but in terms of, how Andrew Yang talks about it, millionaires and billionaires are going to pay vastly more VAT than an ordinary consumer. And it's going to vastly exceed the benefit that they're getting from the basic income.
Most people do not spend $120,000 on stuff per year. That's how much you'd have to spend under Andrew Yang's VAT to take up the entire basic income.
Right.
Yeah. And that's true if you assume that the VAT actually will increase prices, but it won't increase prices anyway. I don't know. There's a lot of kind of like details where if you get into this, if you do it through an income tax, certainly, there's the difference between the gross cost and the net cost where, it can be equivalent to a targeted program if you do the means testing on the taxation side instead of on the benefit side.
Right. He's really against that. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Let me shuffle his words around so that it means something.
Yeah.
What if somebody has so many problems that the UBI is not enough money for them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do they just fall through to the safety net? If somebody is too elderly or too disabled to get along on their $1,000 a month?
Yeah. So whatever the level of basic income is, there are going to be people with special needs. There are going to be people who need to receive additional support,
Right.
and that's always going to be true. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but it means that the programs for, say, the disabled, they don't go away,
Right.
but we hope that they are required less.
Yeah, I think it's true that a lot of people who are disabled today, it really just means they can't work at a job. And if the whole requirement that people work at a job in order to earn a living is gone, then suddenly a lot of people are a lot less disabled. And that's great.
The whole benefits thing too as well.
Yeah, and I would say that programs that are in place or facilities that are in place to support people who need special support, I wouldn't think about that as a safety net anymore. Where I wouldn't like to frame it as a safety net. I would like to frame it as there are these people who need these things, and we're going to support them.
Right. So guide dogs or other services for like the blind. Like your
Right.
basic income might not be enough to like afford really expensive, similar to medical care in general for everyone, I guess.
Right.
To like afford or if there's this graduate student here who was deaf, and so like they had interpreters for her. That's something that would probably be on top of a basic income, because it's kind of expensive, and I would think would stay that way because it's pretty expensive.
And we wouldn't think of that as a safety net. We'd think of that as a special service that someone needs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Although in that case, maybe just an example, that would be a special service that goes away because everybody, depending on how costly the interpreter is, maybe that service can go away, or more in particular, if the deaf person didn't have that service, now they can afford that service.
Could be, yeah.
So whereas they used to fall through to the safety net, they no longer do. I think there would be a lot of people who would no longer have to fall through to the safety net.
I think you're right about that. And I think, one of the cool things about markets is that everybody has different needs. And then if you give people money, that's kind of like a general purpose thing that you can spend on whatever your needs happen to be. So it may very well be the case that this person is able to buy a
application that can either do sign language or like do subtitles on the thing that they're looking at.
Oh, that'd be cool.
There can also be, technology. Yeah, right. And now you have, now you have a lot of disabled people who have a lot of money to spend. Now it's profitable to develop apps for disabled
and
people.
as a side note, I don't think this service is offered generally for everyone. I could be wrong. I think this was like only because the person happened to be able to get into Harvard grad school. So I wasn't trying to give an example of a government
like
service.
you can pay for interpreters on the open market, but
Right.
like there's a very limited labor supply.
Yeah,
you're
I'm
working
sure,
with there,
yeah.
which again, if
there was more of a market,
money,
yeah.
there might be like, oh, well, okay, now,
Right.
Because often places will be like, oh, we can't really afford to pay for interpreters, and you get this vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Of like,
Right.
people are like, well, I'm technically certified to be an interpreter, but
Right.
I don't
No,
get asked
yeah.
to do it a lot.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
One of his criticisms with the healthcare is that one of the ways that they're proposed to pay for a basic income by the libertarian side of it is that like Charles Murray wants to have people pay $1,000 of their basic income or something like that on a health insurance program, so that would take away from their basic income, so they would have less of it, and that would free up the money for it. But
yeah, I think that doesn't make sense. I think it makes sense to keep health insurance as a separate thing because of the incentives involved. You're not necessarily going to be smart if you have to spend your healthcare money yourself. You're not necessarily going to be smart about it because there tends to be these catastrophic events and people don't plan for those well. And it's not just people don't plan for them well, but for a lot of people, they might not even occur to that person. So in expectation, it might not even be smart to plan for something
and it can
like
be
that.
impossible to
Right.
if you're like, oh, this is going to cost me
you can't budget it in.
$100,000.
Right.
You're like, yes, I can definitely save that in the next 5 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
another issue is if you have a heart attack, you're not in a place to choose where you go to be treated.
Yeah.
A place could be 10 times more expensive than another place over here.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems with the libertarian perspective is they really go hard on, trying to balance the budget. That's one of the core tenets of libertarianism. I might even be a libertarian if they didn't believe this, but they do, and it's enough to keep me, it just doesn't, yeah.
Right. Yeah, healthcare has a lot of special properties. I always forget exactly how to explain them in terms of the economics of it, but economists generally think that public health insurance is a good idea, even though economists are often not that liberal. And what is exactly the argument for that? Do you remember?
Just because it's more efficient, you're pooling the risk, all the stuff we said. If
it's
you're
hard to individually plan for that.
Yeah, I mean, what if you're saving up for health insurance? What if you're saving up for healthcare now, but your catastrophic event happens early on, and that kind of thing?
You said,
it's the same reason why we have insurance kind of in any context.
Right.
It's a pooling thing. You don't want each person to have a bucket of water to put out a fire, to put out 3% of a fire in their own house or something like that.
Do you know? Right? Do economists typically say that the insurance or that it should be provided by the government? I thought they did, and I can't remember what the argument was for that.
Well, I mean, as opposed to private insurance, there's it makes it so that everyone is insured, everyone's participating. There are some forms of insurance where if you don't buy it, then you're kind of on the hook. And it's your loss. Whereas something like health insurance, I would imagine, if a lot of people are opting not to get health insurance, then that's bad for everyone, right?
You have epidemics, you have high healthcare costs because people are still not going to be turned away at the emergency.
Yeah. It also helps keep keep prices down in terms of, if you have a single payer, there's a stronger kind of negotiating position because you're representing all the potential clients or patients. Yeah.
Well, the critic of UBI could say, you're giving them $1,000 a month and trusting that they know what's best to do with it, except for medical insurance. Why don't you, if you're so trusting of everybody, why don't you give everybody $2,000 a month and then let them handle their own medical insurance?
Right.
The same way you were going to give them $1,000 a month and let them handle everything else, make all the decisions for everything else except medical insurance.
And I think there are some people who do argue that, and I don't think it's an either or thing, right? Like I think, we don't necessarily, in order to provide universal health care to people, that doesn't necessarily entail a reduction in the basic income, because universal health care is more efficient, right? So that actually helps save us resources. So it could potentially having health care provided for could potentially actually increase the level of basic income we could afford to give people.
I think there's a couple arguments too, though, against why you would trust people to spend money in general for themselves, but it's not even a trust thing, but why it's not as good if you're spending money on health insurance as some of the things we said. Like let's imagine that, what was it? That it's just more efficient pooled or something like that across the entire society?
You're talking about health insurance?
Yeah, he's saying like, is there a reason that it would be less efficient for people to just buy into health insurance with $1,000 a month?
The Koch brothers actually had a study. It was buried that it would actually save $2 trillion over a decade if there were socialized medicine or whatever, rather than privatized health insurance.
Well, if you leave it up to people, then they might not buy health insurance, right?
Right. So I guess.
Like when we talk about food, right? It's like, are we at risk of people have all this money and they're just not going to buy food for themselves? I would say no. Are we at risk of people have all this money and they don't buy health insurance for themselves? Yes.
Yeah,
that is a risk.
And I guess there's a couple of reasons for that. One is like people are kind of notorious. It's notoriously difficult to like plan for faraway future things and like manage those kinds of risks.
Right.
But also, as we pointed out, like even if you don't care about those individual people and you're happy to let them not have health insurance, there's a lot more externalities to other people. Like if you don't have prevention, you might have more disease epidemics. They don't really get turned away at the hospital, so then like you don't prevent the disease and you have the higher cost of like paying for their care later. So there's actually like other arguments, kind of more callous arguments even, about like why it's a little bit different to trust someone not and like just let them not buy health insurance.
And I think it's generally true that health insurance is one example, healthcare is one example, but there are examples of things that for which it is more efficient for the government to provide them directly to people.
Right.
There's lots of things like that. And then there are things that for which it's more efficient for them to be allocated by the markets. Right. And that's what basic income is for, right? It's not about kind of market fundamentalism. Everything has to be, provided by the markets, but it's for the things for which it's most efficient for markets to provide. Basic income allows markets to allocate that stuff efficiently.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't want roads to have to be organized by private people because it's a public goods problem. If I don't want to donate my $20 because I just want to freewell on everyone else.
Oh, I'm going to buy 3 feet of road today.
Yeah, exactly.
With my money. Yeah.
Well, there are private companies that actually build bridges and sections of highways and things, and they expect people to pay tolls to go on those.
I guess that's a way to do it too.
And people often bring up the railroads too, which were a huge private endeavor, and that was big infrastructure and
That's true.
But that was still that the government gave them the tracts of land and the areas around those tracts of land so that they could build those railroads.
Right.
Yeah, I mean there was certainly government cooperation and government support to some extent, and for a lot of like utility type things, even if they're private, you have it's kind of a hybrid, right, between government and private. But yeah, I mean basic income is for the stuff that's just best determined by the markets, and we can have a debate it's not settled which things are best determined by the markets and which aren't. We can have a debate about that too.
Is health insurance one of those or the other?
Yeah. I could imagine, my teenager is a sort of a lifelong vegetarian health nut. So if she stays that way, she might actually calculate correctly that she's never going to get diabetes and heart disease and all of the rich world diseases. So she could actually get a different kind of medical insurance than the rest of us.
Right.
Yeah.
Or she's also, in her generation, there's a lot more thought about, preventative health care and clean living
Right.
than there was in my generation. So, and they might actually spend their $1,000 of medical insurance money on, nutritionists and expensive food, and just, handle health
that's interesting.
their own different way.
Right.
So that, I'm just making up that there could be different opinions of how to spend even the $1,000 of medical insurance.
But you could still like get hit by a bus.
Yeah, it would have to be a different kind of insurance policy geared toward hit by a bus, less geared toward diabetes and
Well,
heart disease.
it's probably that she'd, like if you imagine the private market, she'd be someone who'd maybe pay less on her premium. The way people who don't smoke cigarettes pay less, right?
Yeah.
Now that's interesting because there's some incentives there that we might want to keep. If health insurance is more expensive to people who smoke cigarettes, that's an incentive not to smoke cigarettes. I think there are other ways to achieve that. And I think for certain, the most efficient thing we can do is give everyone the same health insurance as a baseline. And then we can say, are there some incentives that we want to add to the system? So start with everything being the same, and then
You just have like higher vice taxes or whatever.
yeah, you could
just
make
tax
cigarettes,
cigarettes
tax
like we
cigarettes,
already do,
right?
yeah.
That kind of thing. Tax meat, right? So instead of rewarding vegetarians explicitly, oh, you're a vegetarian and you're going to be a vegetarian forever. How do we trust you? Blah, blah, blah. You can
Right.
just say, okay, well, now meat costs 5 times as much. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Which gets really complicated because it's often really like causality is really difficult a lot of times, and you get unintended consequences of if you're like, okay, like we're gonna like tax all these vice things, and you're like, wow, so this ends up disproportionately impacting like poor people who are like, my life is really miserable, and I would like this vice thing to like take the edge off the misery,
Right.
Which is ideally less of an issue in a like functional UBI society.
Ideally,
but
Ideally, yeah. One of the things we talk about as a sort of side benefit of basic income, we've talked about this in here before, is like you have more leeway to use some of these incentives without really damaging people or they just can't afford them. So like this is a small example, but we were talking to someone working at a hospital where they have a lot of like no-show problems, and it's really difficult for the doctors and the other patients, and you don't want to charge like a fee for no-shows to people who can't afford it. But if everybody has a decent income, then you can use that kind of incentive, and that can help with some of these kinds of things. Like you have more room for that.
Yeah. And you can have, for a doctor visit, you can have a small out-of-pocket expense for everyone, no exceptions, if you know that everyone's going to have the money to pay for it.
Right.
And then you prevent the situation of people like overusing the medical system, that kind of thing.
Right.
It gets a lot easier to manage these kinds of things in a world where people don't need special exception because they're so poor or that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. I want to get back to the point that was, I guess, Steve mentioned about, how do you know people are going to spend the money in the right way? And this is a very mainstream thing, and it's a kind of a question that comes up with basic income all the time. Yeah. But it's not a question we ask so much about the money that people get from jobs.
Right, which is really interesting, yeah.
So it is interesting, and it's, people might say, oh, well, they earned the money from the job, whereas this is kind of a government handout, that kind of thing. But I think then it's useful to kind of come back to the idea that the job itself is, in a lot of ways, a government handout because it was created largely by government policy. And maybe that's true to different degrees to different jobs, but it's not like... the idea that you worked at a job and got paid to work at the job, the idea that you earned that money, maybe on one level you did, but on another level, the government decided it wanted you to be able to earn that money. It wanted to give you that money. So on that level, you didn't really earn it. The government just felt like you needed money, so it figured out a way to give you money, right? So that might be something to help kind of dislodge people's thinking in that respect too. Yeah.
There's also an argument that you were that since you didn't spend your money on drugs or whatever that impaired your judgment, that would have caused you you would have caused an accident to do that, and would have gotten fired or sued.
Yeah,
or
I think
whatever.
that's a really good point. Yeah,
Mhm.
they
Wait, I'm
assume that
sorry?
the jobs. I think what you're saying, Richard, is like there's an assumption that holding on to a job, you're already sort of naturally filtering. You're not, so you already can't have like maybe a major drug addiction, or you wouldn't be able to hold down the job. So you're already spending
Yeah.
the money that
So-
Like,
I mean,
nobody was like high on coke all the time in like the upper levels of finance.
Well,
So-
or that is spending the money correctly because it's helping them do their job. So,
right.
or that they're being functional somehow with it. Yeah.
So
yeah,
I think
yeah,
we know
exactly
that,
right.
that some people are going to have these kinds of problems.
Right.
Some people are going to spend their money in ways that harm themselves. Now the question is, how do we help those people?
Right.
I don't think the answer is to withhold money from people unless they demonstrate that they can do it correctly. And I also don't think the answer is to create all these jobs and then use the labor market as a filtering mechanism to see who's spending their money responsibly,
No,
because you can
really
hold down a job.
inefficient.
That is really inefficient. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I
yeah.
think here's an example where if you could shift the mainstream discourse to more the idea
Yeah.
of like fundamental economic infrastructure, or like
Yeah.
less like more away from this is like really something that we're doing for like poor people and not everyone else, that helps with it. Now it doesn't really address the root problem, which is that people have this stereotype about poor people in the first place, but it would shift the thought around basic income towards something that's kind of something that everyone needs to have.
Yeah. And I think, Social Security is a universal benefit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right.
And if it's something that everyone kind of gets as a right of
How do we
citizenship.
know that when you're older, you're not spending all that money on,
On drugs. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. And we like you said, Richard, we get used to the benefits or programs that are there. And we also see that they're not like having, I guess this is where the benefit, we've talked about this before, of like the little experiments comes in, is like you see that the benefit is there and people aren't just like somehow becoming worse off because you gave them money or something like that.
But we sometimes get this weird bias. Like I think it comes up in the interview and not in this one, but about how like essentially like the middle class like supports. We're like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like
Right.
the people don't talk about like like we're like, oh, like welfare, like people are clearly abusing that, but we're not like, oh, Social Security, people are definitely abusing
Right.
that. Then it's like, well, okay, like they're
Right.
like you would think that like because welfare is like means tested, that
Right.
you should have like an expectation, like a more positive, like okay, I think it's less likely people are going to abuse that.
Right.
But
Right.
instead of like, oh yeah, Social Security, like people paid into that and like they earned it and like.
Yeah.
So of course they're going to be responsible.
Right. I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of it is like, part of the abuse idea with welfare is that only some people are supposed to get it, and like with Social Security, everybody's supposed to get it. So yeah.
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 But there's like other stuff like where it's like, oh, you're like mortgage subsidy like difference. It's
Right.
Like, oh, okay, like you get this thing, not
Totally.
like.
Yeah.
It's like,
And then there's the
So
whole
it's-
like welfare queen thing where she has 5 Social Security numbers and she gets 5 Social Security texts or whatever.
Yeah,
Right.
It's like
So I think
stigmatized in a way that somehow like white collar crime isn't.
Right.
Like,
Right.
yes, I just like siphoned all of this money from my employer is
Right.
fine in a way that like food stamp like theft or abuse or whatever. Where it's like, wow, I like gave some of my food stamps for dollars, so I could like buy diapers because you can't buy diapers
Yeah.
with food stamps.
Yeah.
Like,
And there's a lot of kind of discussion. Like we can go pretty deep into like what the optimal level of punishment is for different crimes in terms of like the outcome you want, in terms of how many people are continuing to commit these crimes and how it affects people and all that stuff. And it's not just about kind of like how bad it is. Like there's a lot of factors that go into that. I don't need to go into that now, but I was just kind of.
But I think another
bringing
point
that up.
here is like what we've talked about a lot, where if, like one of the advantages of giving the basic income to everybody is it doesn't become associated. It becomes something that people feel is also for their own group, which sadly, like you said,
Right.
with mortgage programs or something, like people see that as like usually a totally natural, great thing for their own group to get some kind of benefit.
Yeah.
And so it becomes less about like this other group that's somehow taking money from me and like I'm going to be suspicious of that or try to undermine it.
To Elizabeth's point, and related to what Annie Lowrey brought up in the interview, is that the government supports people in a lot of ways,
Right.
and only some of those ways are stigmatized. So we can kind of look at them and see like kind of what leads something to be stigmatized versus not. I think sometimes it's probably political mostly, and then other times there might be certain features of it, like it only goes to some people and that kind of thing.
Right.
But it's interesting because
or being against poor people. I don't know what the word is for having stereotypes about poor people.
And it's interesting because the job of the government is to support the people. Like that's why we have a government, right? And it's interesting that some forms of support we really feel negatively about, and other forms we don't. Like as a culture, everyone in here is fine.
So this weird bootstrapping idea. Like, if the government is like subsidizing your business, it's like, you're like a self-starter entrepreneur, and so it's great that the government is helping you. But if you are just so I'm like really poor and I have like 2 kids and I can't afford to feed them, it's like, you're clearly doing something wrong. That you need the government to like help you feed your children. You're like not working hard enough or something.
Yeah. I think it's this idea partly about like, am I getting, as the person judging, am I getting value out of this, or am I losing something out of this? And like with this idea of my kind of tax dollars going to this other family, I think the idea with the business, right or wrong, is that somehow maybe that's boosting the economy as a whole, and so it's not really just like coming from my tax dollars. Maybe it's
your
even
tax dollars.
Making
that's a mainstream thing.
I think this is I think this is sort of the idea. Like maybe it's like boosting my property value or whatever. Versus like, how is this woman feeding her kid ever helping me? It's like she's just taking my tax dollars, and people wouldn't necessarily always be so explicitly callous about it. But I think that comes from this
intuition, even though it like is actually the reverse. Right. Like it's like, okay, if you really believe in the free market, then like your business shouldn't need a subsidy. It should be like, living or dying on its own merits. Like the government is like interfering in the free market. Whereas like if someone can't feed their kid, like that should be like a thing that we all care about as like humans. To be like, I'm better off like in society when children are not dying of hunger. Like that is a benefit to me to not be like. I was like, who would be like, I'm going to withhold my tax dollars from this starving child?
The reality is that individual people, starving children, and everyone else, they need support from the government. And the free market also needs support from the government. And both of those things are okay, right? You can't have a market without the institutions that support it. Go ahead, Richard.
I think there's a whole, things built up in our society about divide and conquer and righteous indignation and perception being more important than fact, and so many different things that we just need the whole factor of schadenfreude. We need to feel superior to that person over there. That we need people to feel better about themselves.
The whole Southern strategy is about like, you feel better to be like, we're gonna like poor Black people and poor white people, like we can't let them like work together. So like, if you've got someone you can feel better than, you can be like, yes, I will buy into the system.
So I think even with a basic income in place, even with like a full basic income that's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy, there's still plenty of room for people to find ways to feel better than other people. I'm not worried about that going away. So let's go on to another quote.
Go ahead. Go ahead, but also you might want to get to the other articles.
There's one thing from the other article that I'll do, but I like this article better.
Okay.
So basic economic theory implies that taxes on income are distortionary inasmuch as they discourage work and investment. Moreover, governments should avoid transfers to the same people from whom they collect revenue. But that is precisely what a UBI would do.
So this is actually, I found this interesting and I was confused about it because we often talk about like, let's imagine that you did feel you had to fund it with taxes. Like, wouldn't it be simpler to just give everyone the same UBI and that way it's like not stigmatized and then just handle it on the tax end? But he seems to be saying that that's bad. And I was wondering what his argument was there.
So I think he's worried that it's inefficient because you're giving people the money and then you're taking it away again. It's 2 steps. I think that's his concern. But I'm with you. I think it's much, much simpler to, on the income distribution side, to make it a flat thing, and then all the complexities and means testing, et cetera, can be on the taxation side. Because now, if if there's a mistake or the government fails in some way, instead of failing to give people the money they need, maybe they accidentally didn't collect taxes from someone, or someone evaded the taxes or something like that. That is not nearly as much of a problem as someone who's poor not getting the support that they need.
Right.
So the people who pay the taxes, the people who are paying like income taxes or more income taxes and that kind of thing, are the ones who have the resources to navigate these complexities. And it also makes more sense for the government in terms of their incentives. If they want to collect all the taxes, now they have an extra incentive to get it right. Whereas if it's a payout, now there might be a perverse incentive there where the government might not be explicitly making decisions because of this, but if this particular benefit program is maybe less efficient and some of the people who qualify aren't getting it, that's a savings right there.
Right.
And I'm sure that in terms of the statistics of the costs and all that stuff,
right.
they factor in how much money is actually being spent on those programs, which is less than what it would be if everyone who qualified actually got the benefit.
Right. And we were talking with that
Yeah.
social worker who was really concerned about like even the money allocated for the program.
Right, Diane Pagan.
Pagan not ending up in the hands of the people that really needed it, and there were a lot of like political dealings, she was saying, and like insider things where like it was kind of getting spent on things it wasn't supposed to be spent on.
Right.
So if you simplify it there's other benefits, like you avoid corruption, you avoid
Right.
the kinds of things you were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's important.
Yep.
Cool.
So then the first part of this, he talks about taxes on income are distortionary in as much as they discourage work and investment. I think taxes on income, of course, they change people's incentives. If you know you're going to get taxed, there's less of an incentive to earn the income, and
right.
that kind of stuff. But in terms of discouraging work and investment, it comes into this whole labor thing again. Like, we need to encourage work. Well, how you encourage work is you pay people to do things.
But he's saying they get paid less if you tax them.
Yeah, and I mean that's fine, but it's not. The fact that he emphasizes that, I think is reflecting this kind of like primacy that we put toward labor, both in our society and in our economic thought. Yeah. Richard.
There's also an argument that if for like CEO pay and things like that and board pay, that if you have the tax higher enough, then that decreases the incentive to keep increasing the CEO's pay all the time, because they don't get as much every time.
And I think
like stock options or whatever.
Right. And I think Acemoglu would argue that counts as a distortionary effect that is maybe undesirable. Because these companies, they want the best CEOs, right? And if the best CEO, if you can't pay enough to get the best CEO, that can have huge ramifications for the operation of the business and whether it's profitable, whether it stays in business, that kind of thing. So I think it is kind of the mainstream view that CEOs get paid too much relative to their workers and that kind of thing. But I think that also comes from this idea that there's this lump sum of money, and the fact that the CEO has more means that the workers have less, or something like that, or means that the general population has less, because workers, should we care about workers or should we care about people? And if in an efficient labor market, you're only concerned about people who you want to spend their time different than how they'd ordinarily do it, and you only want to pay them as much as gets them to do the thing the way you want them to do it. Like, that's the only thing we really need from the labor market. So that was kind of a tangent.
But then there's these companies like Sears where they get paid enormous sums even though their company is failing, and then they're also dismantling their company at the same time that their company is failing.
Yeah. So that has to do with there's a lot of things that go into that. And then the question is, what is the best outcome for Sears? Is it best for the economy? Is it best for our society if Sears does shut down? In that case, maybe it's not a problem.
But I guess there can be internal incentive problems in the company, is
right.
what Richard's pointing out.
Right. And there's also the whole issue with activist investors, where they want to make money by buying a struggling company and running it into the ground and paying dividends on their shares and that kind of thing. So there are problems, like, obviously, like I say this a lot, but there are problems that basic income doesn't solve. I don't know that taxing CEO pay would necessarily solve this, because you could still pay dividends on the shares. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of complicated stuff that maybe we'll get into in a future discussion. But it's not as simple as just saying CEOs don't deserve, like they're not providing that much value, therefore or that multiple of the value, therefore they don't deserve as much. People don't get paid based on how much value they produce. They get paid based on what's necessary to incentivize them to do the thing. And that's normal. So here's another quote.
So negative income tax.
Besides, a more sensible policy is already on offer, a negative income tax, or what is sometimes called guaranteed basic income. Rather than giving everyone $1,000 per month, a guaranteed income program would offer transfers only to individuals whose monthly income is below $1,000, thereby coming in at a mere fraction of UBI's cost. So this gets into the whole gross cost versus net cost thing, right? Like a negative income tax is mathematically equivalent to a basic income plus an income tax, like those two things combined. So here we mostly talk about basic income. There are some people who think that there should be an income tax. If you combine those two things, that's a negative income tax. One concern is that if you're doing the benefit on the tax, like through the taxation system, are they only going to get it once a year? Do they have to file their taxes in order to get the benefit? That kind of thing. Some people might argue that as a positive, because now people file their taxes, and if you didn't force people to file the taxes to get the benefit, maybe they owed a lot of taxes, but they didn't file and they got the benefit anyway, or something like that. I would say that's on the government to figure that out.
But there's also an issue with it that if they get in a lump sum, that they would accrue debt, and they would have to pay interest on that debt for the entire year. But if they received it monthly, they might not have to.
Yeah. There are all kinds of problems with receiving it in a lump sum, and it's not just the interest, it's also the fact that, maybe you don't spend wisely and then you run out of money after 6 months or something like that. So I think it is smart to have it be, to have the payout be kind of a flat basic income that comes at frequent intervals, if not continuous. And then if you really want to do anything complicated, I said this before, if you really want to do anything complicated, do it on the taxation side. And if you like the structure of a negative income tax, you can achieve that. All you have to do is have an income tax. Income tax combined with basic income is a negative income tax.
His main point here is that you're not giving $1,000 to everyone. You're just topping off people who make under $1,000 a month.
Yeah, but it's the same thing, right? Like if you give $1,000 a month to everyone and then take it back in the income tax, then it's mathematically the same.
I think
it's the difference between, like Richard was saying, gross cost and net cost.
Another thing that comes to mind here is like the fact that now you are somewhat disincentivized also here to make more money if you're around anywhere near that border.
With the
topping off.
the income tax? Well, it's not a flat topping off, right? It's like you get the benefit here, and then the tax you pay is here. So if you're below this level, you're paying more and more, or you're getting more and more of a benefit. If you're up here, you're getting more and more.
Well, his is. I thought it was pretty specific.
It's not just a topping off. It's an income tax, like a continuous income tax that increases as you get more income combined with the basic income. That's a negative income tax. Okay. Yeah, you don't have the welfare cliff that you're worried about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have the meta question that I figured out, and you figured out, and surely the author has figured out that you can just fiddle with the income tax curve and get the effect you want. So why didn't he say that?
So I think that's a really good question, and I think part of it might be that he wants it to be part of the taxation system, because he thinks of that as being more efficient. So you already are when people file their income taxes, you already know what their income is. You already have that information to work with. So then you can it's no extra work. All you have to do is give people the appropriate amount of money, or take the appropriate amount of money. Okay. He feels like it can just be like a slight modification to the rules of the existing system with no additional infrastructure.
But it's really complicated if you're a seasonal worker, because you have to calculate what you're going to have, and you have to it might split in half how much income you have.
Right. And personally, I don't like income taxes at all because of a lot of these complexities and because of the distortions to the market and all of that. So that's kind of an incentive that I have to kind of keep them separate. So yes, we are already doing this, but it's debatable as to how well we're doing this. And, the people who don't, file taxes or don't have the wherewithal to file taxes are often the ones who would need the basic income benefit anyway too. So I really think it's more efficient from a social welfare standpoint and from a market efficiency standpoint, making sure everyone has the spending money, to really just give everyone the money and then put it on the government to figure out how to take the money that they want to take, if they want to take any money. Yeah. So we're going to go to the other article. I have a particular quote that I like from the other one, and it's not that one. You can see I had way more than we were going to be able to get through. So this is really about what we're talking about. So here Annie Lowrey goes through kind of the main, all the different versions of basic income and all the different arguments for basic income that you hear about. And none of them are the ones that we talk about here.
Maybe you should read the questions so the...
Okay, I'll read the question that
she's responding
that
to.
James Pethokoukis asks. So it's... But that is what I think captures people, this idea that we're seeing this big economic transformation, because there are a few quotes in the book, this book, of people saying this is a big change. And if you're going to have a big change, there must be a reason for the big change. And 5 people owning all the robots and the rest of us working for them, well, that would be a big change. But your argument doesn't require super intelligent AI. And she says, no, I don't think we have any idea what AI is doing in the economy. I think that's right. So to your point, you have this libertarian/conservative argument that basically the government shouldn't be trying to micromanage people's lives. So in the SNAP program, or food stamps, currently in some states you can buy sweet potatoes but not white potatoes.
Oh, yeah,
so let's stop doing that. Let's get rid of HHS and all these other huge departments and just give people money. This is Charles Murray's argument. He's been making it for 20 or 30 years. Then you have the liberal argument, which is that our system right now is not redistributed enough. We have an alarming number of people in poverty given how wealthy the country is. So UBI might be something to create a true backstop, a true insurance, and we're going to say nobody is going to fall below some level. And then the third big argument comes from Silicon Valley, which is like, we're sorry we're going to take all of your jobs, but instead of having your nice $65,000 a year job as a truck driver, you'll have $12,000 a year thanks to UBI, so you'll be fine. Which I think is an insane argument, but it is indeed the one that they're making. You'll have great video games, and you can make art or whatever it is. And I actually would say that there is a fourth argument, which is a related argument to the liberal argument. We should have an income guarantee. Richard Nixon actually was into this idea, that we can use the tax code to implement negative income tax and eliminate poverty. It's kind of a clean and easy solution. It costs something like $200 billion a year currently, which is a lot of money, but it's not trillions of dollars. And it's not a totally crazy amount of money. You could certainly finance it with small changes in the tax code or by reducing other programs. So this is kind of like the gamut of mainstream basic income thought right here,
That's
I would say.
interesting.
Yeah,
It's
Richard.
like with the Silicon Valley version, the $12,000 would top up if you got another job that still, say, paid $50,000. You would still make $62,000, which would be far closer to what you had before.
I don't think anyone's arguing that you lose a 60. So I think or she. This is a she now. It's Annie Lowrey. I think she's straw manning a little bit here.
Yeah.
It's not. No one's saying that you lose a $65,000 a year job and then you'll only have $12,000. They're saying you lose your $65,000 a year job and you might have to go to a lower paying job, and the $12,000 can make up some or all of the
Right.
difference.
Or maybe
Yeah.
they're not committed to always
Right.
being that low in the first place. Like.
Right. Yeah. I think all of these kind of formulations of basic income assume that it's going to be like some minimal amount to bring people up to a certain poverty level or something like that. And I think that is the mainstream view. The kind of Andrew Yang $1,000 a month, or Charles Murray, same thing. They all kind of have it as like it's enough to get people out of poverty. They're thinking about it as kind of like an anti-poverty program instead of economic infrastructure. Whereas, with me, it's like, we don't know how much consumer spending the economy can handle. Let's find out. And let's bring it up to the maximum, get the maximum benefit, and allow markets to be efficient. Oh, that's should be there so we can still see people. Yeah, anyone, or let's actually go around and get final thoughts on this discussion. Mainstream basic income.
Well, I like this last quote. I do think these are lots of different sort of mainstream views, somewhat. I think it's really, really challenging to think about how the views that, you talk about or we're really passionate about would become more mainstream.
Yeah.
Because something like the automation thing or whatever, as they sort of pointed out in the question, actually, is an easier hook for why you would see such a big change. I think you put it well. Right. So yeah, it's worth thinking about that.
Yeah. Steve?
Well, I have to, the reason I got into basic income was actually because of what I'll call a citizen's dividend. That people were getting rich partly from using public stuff. And so the public should have been getting, but wasn't getting, their cut. Typical example is the Alaska Permanent Fund, where the oil companies get wealthy from the oil, but of course the oil is under the land of Alaska, and you have to assume that the land of Alaska is owned by the public of Alaska in this case, and that they should get a cut, and so they do. It's $2,000 a year for every citizen. I think that this is the best argument for UBI, is the citizens' dividend.
That's a good point.
And as I keep studying this, it becomes increasingly harder to avoid because people keep sort of stumbling into it as accidentally justifying UBI or whatever their economic plan is. So I think Alex has to make a bigger effort to shoot it down because it's going to keep coming up. Not right now, but eventually. It's not going away. And it's in that book, as described in that book, Radical Market.
Excuse me, yep. That's interesting.
Well, another thing about the citizens' dividend is that companies like, Apple or whatever, they don't actually do a lot of R&D. They just combine all the basic research that the government does for, like, say, joysticks and things like that, and combine it with their things. And just last year, the University of Wisconsin had sued Samsung and Apple, and because they say that they copied all their research, and then they won $26 billion because the court decided that they did copy all their stuff. They didn't get any credit for it.
Oh, interesting.
Well, this reminds me that actually Andrew Yang, when he's talking about drug prices, one of his reasons for why drug prices should go down is, as Richard said, that the basic research for it was funded by the taxpayer,
right.
But the taxpayer isn't getting his cut.
Funded by the government.
Yeah.
So
not the taxpayer.
But he's praising Andrew Yang's argument.
You're right. That's what Andrew Yang says. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
So now I don't know that Andrew Yang has thought deeply about the citizens' dividend and Henry George and all of that, but people keep sort of stumbling into.
He does call it a freedom dividend, so he uses the word dividend, which is funny.
So he's sort of claiming that the public should get their cut, but I don't think he has a particular philosophical viewpoint on public property.
Cool.
Slipped into it by accident.
I think there's kind of like inklings of that in there, and he draws the analogy to Alaska, and he's like, people need a cut of our technological progress and that kind of thing. But I don't think he has that kind of overarching philosophy.
He doesn't know the can of worms that he might be opening if he is around me, for instance.
we should get him around you, Elizabeth.
Tabling ideas about private property and how we stole it all from indigenous people to begin with, and all of that.
Right.
I think about this sort of the last one sort of reminded me about this sort of how such a big part of the mainstream discourse is how it's it'll just be this very minimal poverty level thing, and how that's so closely tied to the idea of there's only a fixed pie to pay it out of, and and how it's like, oh yeah, so we're gonna like cut these social programs, but it's not going to be enough to like make up for that, and just a sort of general like sense of like, oh, we're working with such a constrained thing instead of like the way that you tend to frame it as sort of like, yeah, like productive capacity of the economy, and like this like a thing that that gets talked about in a lot of like religious spaces is sort of like an economy of abundance versus an economy of scarcity, of like, okay, like, which is often in like faith context about like, okay, like, do you have trust that like, that stuff will be, that like you'll have like what you need, but I feel sort of relevant to this about like, okay, like, do we have like an economy of scarcity of like, okay, there's this very fixed pie and like we have to very efficiently allocate the things, or is it like an economy of abundance of like, okay, like we can print money and we can, provide all this stuff for the people, and like that's not going to be a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a great discussion. So Mitchell says he feels like there can be an encore of this topic. I think this is a good topic and there's a lot to it, and we'll probably come back to it. My mom says it's hard to oversimplify it enough as a political necessity, a soundbite. But if it comes back into public discourse enough, there will be enough incentive to understand more about how it would work. I think that's right. I think the more we talk about it, the more there are going to be people interested in understanding basic income at a deeper level. So great discussion, everyone. Next week, we're going to be talking about the idea of a data dividend. So paying people for the data they generate online as they're using various services. And the kind of moral rationale is that companies are making a lot of money using people's data. Shouldn't they get a cut? So it's kind of this "shouldn't they get a cut" thing again. And there's a chapter about it in Radical Markets, which is I'll have to read more of that book, but I definitely read that chapter. So yeah, excited to talk about that with you guys next week.
Thanks
everybody.
and Mitchell and everyone here. Yeah, good.
Maybe we could do like a religious